You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmaswaran from Washington, D.C. And Ankit, today, after I think you did a podcast last week on North Korea's military parade, which was a very interesting development. So today, let's maybe switch and talk about more of the Olympics angle to all of this, where we saw, I guess, a lot of uh, news, developments, analysis about inter-Korean rapprochement, about U.S. North Korea relations, about all manner of things within the context of the Olympic Games, which I can't remember. I usually watch these ceremonies or parts of these ceremonies. I can't recall this much interest in the Olympic Games from a political angle beyond the actual sporting event. So I guess just a couple of things before we get started. I mean, this idea of the inter-Korean rapprochement at the Olympics, um, they've marched together before several times, but this is the first time they're doing so with the Olympic Games being hosted by South Korea. So that's why they had quite significant interest. But obviously, the political element of this is very interesting as well. I mean, we've had the new Moon government come to power in South Korea, and they've adopted, unsurprisingly, more of an engagement first approach to the North Koreans. And we've also had constant talk, including on this podcast as well, about the prospects for U.S. North Korea relations, as well as potential for the military option to be executed with the so-called bloody nose strategy. And we had these dynamics play out at the Olympics Games. And I guess if I were to sort of put a broad frame to all of this, it was the contrast between Mike Pence, who was looking as fierce as he could in the Olympic Games, with this campaign of maximum pressure by the Trump administration, and the sort of warmth of engagement by the Moon administration that we saw, and also the visit of Kim Yo-jong, which is the younger sister of Kim Jong-un, at the Olympic Games. So a lot to talk about. Where should we start with that?
Yeah, I think a good place to start is just to give listeners a TikTok of how we got here, right? I think
Mhm.
people who've been listening to this podcast heard us talking about potential military options, about North Korean missiles, about the nuclear test last year. 2017 was an unusually provocative year for North Korea. It showed off two different intercontinental range ballistic missile designs, tested its highest yield thermonuclear weapon ever. And, we saw President Trump threaten to totally destroy the country, missiles flying over Japan, threats to bracket Guam. And then all of a sudden now, we're looking at these images coming out of South Korea of inter-Korean warmth. So how did we get here? All of this happened quite suddenly. So after Kim Jong-un delivers his New Year's Day address that he's been doing since 2013 this year, he invites, he wishes the South Koreans all the best for a successful Winter Olympics, and he opens the door for talks. And I think the South Koreans, as you correctly noted, since, the Moon government came into power in May, the government's had a pro-engagement disposition. The Moon is a veteran of the previous government of Roh Moo-hyun when he served as chief of staff. He's very much rooted in the South Korean left liberal tradition, which favors a set of economic policies, but also has generally been pro-engagement. Famously, Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun oversaw the sunshine period in inter-Korean ties for about 10 years, which the governments of Lee Myung-bak and Park Geun-hye completely reversed. The Lee government declared the sunshine policy a failure in 2010. So effectively, Kim Jong-un makes this overture. The South Koreans respond. There is a first meeting at Panmunjom between the directors of the respective governments' unification ministries, and they reopen their military hotline, and talks continue. There is the agreement, finally, to have a joint team at the Olympics to march together under the unified peninsula flag. And of course, we then end up with this historic summit where Kim Yong-nam, the figurehead head of state of North Korea, a very old man in his 90s, and Kim Yo-jong, Kim Jong-un's younger sister, who's been elevated to an important role on the Politburo, travel south of the demilitarized zone. Kim Jong-nam becoming the highest-ranking North Korean official to travel south of that border, and Kim Yo-jong being the first member of the Kim family to travel south of that border since the Korean War. And then we see, these striking images coming out of the Blue House, the presidential office in South Korea, of a meeting between the two sides. There's laughter, they're smiling. It seems that, things are going well. And then we, of course, find out that the North Korean delegation has delivered a message for an inter-Korean summit with President Moon. So that's kind of the TikTok of kind of how things really developed on the inter-Korean front. It's a little bit simplified. There was a lot more going on behind the scenes. Obviously, there's a domestic debate in South Korea about how the Moon government should be treating this. And, we should point out that the question of Korean unification, which I think I discussed on a podcast with Stephen Denny recently, reverberates very differently with the new generation in South Korea. Millennials and even Generation X to a degree just simply see other things as greater priorities, including kind of bread and butter issues like unemployment, economic growth, issues like that are more important for them than kind of the symbolic unification of the country. But, Prashant, I guess where I'm kind of interested in taking this conversation is that, there's been a lot of cause for optimism, especially with the symbolism of the Olympics. I mean, it's difficult not to find it inspirational to see the two Korean teams marching beneath a flag. I mean, obviously their results at the sport games are different. The hockey team did not do particularly well. But, I think, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I think that this period of rapprochement will probably end up unwinding pretty quickly.
Yeah, no, I think it's difficult to disagree with that. And I think the big question, as you pointed out, is, how long will this go on for? What, if anything, will come out of it? And I think the sense is not very much. But also, what are the costs that the international community, or more narrowly the United States, South Korea, and other countries going to bear in terms of managing the North Korean challenge while this plays out, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've already seen some indicators of this in terms of the South Koreans asking for a postponement of U.S. South Korea military exercises that are regularly held. Now there are questions about whether this probably could be postponed yet again if this inter-Korean summit plays out. There's all kinds of implications about what delays, about pressure on the North Koreans might do in terms of advances about their program, in terms of further economic concessions that they could gain from South Korea. But also, I do think that you pointed out a really interesting angle that we shouldn't ignore, which is the domestic sentiment in South Korea. There were polls that were coming out. I think Gallup released a poll a few days before the Olympics showing that Moon's approval ratings had fallen by, I think, 6 points. I mean, public opinion in South Korea is pretty fickle. And so I wouldn't sort of read too much into that. But there is sort of this question, which is in the event that this does not go down well, as we've seen with previous ways of engagement, what are the costs, and who's going to bear sort of the responsibility and absorb the cost for that domestically, but also internationally. And I think the other component that's really interesting here is how the Japanese are perceiving all of this, and there are dynamics between the United States and South Korea, because Prime Minister Abe has been very clear about his messaging that they shouldn't take North Korea's bait on this engagement proposal, and they should be very cautious about how they're highlighting this. But obviously, that creates fissures between Japan and South Korea that, to a certain extent, are already there, but also places it more in sort of closer to where the United States and the Trump administration is in all of this. So that's a very interesting dynamic as well, I think, to watch for.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You raised a bunch of really good points. So first, let me respond to the domestic point. I think it's completely valid. It's a little difficult for me to parse the change in approval ratings because I think it also collided with a bunch of other things going on in South Korea, like this whole the cryptocurrency regulation stuff. I think really hurt the Moon government at the polls and came around the same time as the inter-Korean rapprochement was beginning. And also, we see a general trend with new South Korean presidents entering office with high approvals, and then gradually the public going sour on them. So we'll
Yep.
see if Moon's going to defy that trend. But certainly, I think it's an issue. I think what's interesting is that the right wing opposition in South Korea has been quite vocal about the North Korean rapprochement. But I think just after Park Geun-hye's scandal, the South Korean conservatives have simply not recovered to a point where they're having a singular and widespread effect on the national discourse. So I think the opposition has been quite easy for the Moon government to ignore, at least for now. On the alliance management stuff, I think, yeah, I mean, that's also been a striking point for me where I maybe differ with a few US based observers. I think there was a little bit of a panic when these inter-Korean talks were happening, and especially when Mike Pence was going around. In a way, depending on your perspective, he seemed a bit rude to his hosts in South Korea by not, really adhering to protocol, not standing when the joint Korean team entered the ceremonies, shaking everyone's hands at the dinner except for the North Koreans. Although that does make sense on a diplomatic level. But everything that Pence was doing and everything that Moon were doing, just seemed a little bit dissonant. To some people, it looked like alliance decoupling. But I think it's a little bit too early to say that the alliance is about to crumble. I mean, yes, there are some worrying signs. Like, I actually worry about the delay to the exercises was probably necessary for an overture like this to occur, but they can't be delayed further, and the two sides haven't fixed a date yet. So it does give them a little bit of wiggle room. They've simply said it will happen after the Paralympics end, which is on March 18th. Doesn't mean they have to start on March 19th. They could start on April 1st, giving sort of a 10-day period for this potential inter-Korean summit to take place. But really, I mean, these exercises will ultimately have to happen. And that's part of the reason that I'm a little skeptical, is that the U.S. will not want to see the exercises visibly degraded as a result of the inter-Korean talks. And I think the South Korean government is smart enough to know that. And to give the South Koreans quite a bit of credit here, it's that the Moon government is smart enough to know where the limits are on engagement, and that's true when it comes to sanctions. That's true when it comes to the alliance with the United States, and they're not just going to give away all sorts of things. I think a lot of commentators in the U.S. also just have a little bit of a condescending approach to the South Koreans sometimes. That it's like, oh look, they're going into the talks, they're going to give away the horse before we can manage the alliance. And it's, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, this is a legitimate democratically elected government that's that has some degree of a right to conduct its affairs with its northern neighbor. But I also think that the Moon government will work with the United States on this. I mean, last year I think we were both a little bit pleasantly surprised by the Moon government's reaction to North Korea's continued missile testing. I mean, the Moon barely had a week in office before North Korea tested the Hwasong-12 successfully, and then obviously by July we have the new ICBM. And Moon and Trump actually, despite their differences, despite the Korea-U.S. free trade agreement issue, managed to make it through the year pretty successfully. And I think now it's time for the United States to return that favor and work with the South Koreans.
Mhm. Right. And I think the other angle here that's interesting to approach, so we looked at the sort of South Korean component, and you're right. I mean, there are so many issues there. I mean, whether it's, sort of the usual degree of autonomy question in alliance management between countries, but also, I mean, it is interesting to see when these events happen, you do have um, divisions between liberal and conservative camps in all of these countries involved, really, right? I mean, whether it's the United States, whether it's South Korea, and Japan as well, um, that favor engagement or are less favorable or more skeptical of engagement. So I also think that is important to keep in mind as well, that this is only partly about South Korea and North Korea. I think these views really are deeply held beyond those, and part of that is political, beyond the issues themselves. I think the other thing that's interesting to talk about is the U.S. role in all of this. I mean, I guess Pence, as I mentioned earlier, started off at the Olympic Games, quite steely, looking very resolved, and this idea of a maximum pressure approach and taking a very tough stance. But on the way back and since then, I mean, the White House has also tempered that a little bit with an idea that the door is slightly more open to some talks,
Mm-hmm.
even if this maximum pressure approach continues. Now, I myself, I'm pretty skeptical about the degree of change that we've seen. I mean, depending on who the United States talks to, it seems, whether it's South Korea or Japan, or what President Trump is saying versus what Mike Pence is saying, it seems like there isn't that much that has changed. I mean, they're keeping the door open to some form of dialogue without preconditions, but the maximum pressure approach is still there. And I do sense that, as we've been discussing here, a lot of this is going to depend on what the North Koreans do, what the South Koreans do, more so than whether it's a policy that's being dictated by the United States. But sort of curious about your thoughts there, about where you come down on the degree to which we actually saw some of this policy change. I do think some media outlets did play that up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I continue to see very little real change since probably about August 2017. August 2017 was interesting because Mattis, Defense Secretary Jim Mattis and Secretary of State Rex Tillerson penned an op-ed together in the Wall Street Journal, where for the first time they put to paper an offer for talks with different conditions, not denuclearization conditions, but a testing moratorium. And then Joe Yun, the special representative, clarified that effectively the United States wanted to see the North Koreans come out and make some kind of statement, even possibly privately, saying that they are entering a period of ballistic missile moratorium. So they would make that announcement, and then once 60 days had passed, the United States would take that as a show of good faith and then enter talks. Obviously, that never happened. And, this whole thing with Pence too, I think, is sort of building on that with a little bit of a shift now. I think maybe the United States thinks that the North Koreans don't need to conduct short-term missile testing. They still need to conduct tests of their ICBMs further, I think, but perhaps in the short term that there is a path to some kind of talks about talks. But again, it's the problem that we've had with U.S. policy is that multiple senior officials are reading from separate books on policy. So you have kind of the NSC crowd, which has been more in favor of preemptive strikes, has a entirely divergent theory of what North Korea seeks with its nuclear weapons. We've had officials at the NSC, including McMaster, imply that Kim Jong-un is irrational, undeterrable, seeks to coercively unify the peninsula using his nuclear weapons. And then we've had the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Pacific Commander Harry Harris say that North Korea's weapons are for deterrence purposes. And, the elephant in the room again, I think, is the president, who at any moment, could make a comment off the cuff saying that, you'll see what will happen to North Korea, some kind of really obscure and ambiguous threat that, again, will throw everything off kilter. So anything could happen. I'm not particularly optimistic, but, I'll say the source of my optimism has little to do with diplomatic acumen in the United States. I think that's been a constant throughout the last even going back past the Trump administration. This has really never been led by the United States. The North Koreans have managed to set the tone of a lot of what happens with engagement, and I think they've been able to do that successfully. There is a degree of a success here for North Korea with all of this that's happening, and you have to think about what they're going to ask for if an inter-Korean summit happens. There are some of the low-level takeaways like family reunions, potentially a restart of the Kaesong industrial complex, which will be difficult because of the expansion of the sanctions regime. Or, the North Koreans ask for more dramatic takeaways, things that will legitimately put a wedge in the alliance and begin that decoupling process. And that is North Korea's ultimate objective. So I think, we just need to be wary of where the North Koreans are looking to take this. And I think, if we reconvene for a podcast in 2 months' time, when the U.S.-South Korea exercises are underway, and, we have an inter-Korean summit behind us by then, it'll be, I think that the possibility of us being in a very different place will be quite likely.
Great. Yeah, I think that's a good note to end on with that sort of cautiously optimistic tone. And before we go, I just wanted to ask one final question, Ankit. So, you monitor North Korea's missile developments quite closely, security developments, but also North Korea's, domestic developments as well. What are you looking for, in the next few months, whether it's testing from North Korea, whether it's their approach to engagement, but also this Byunjin project and the North Korean economy with this maximum pressure approach and the sanctions. I mean, what should listeners be watching for in that respect?
Yeah, I mean, another thing we have to look forward to in April is Kim Il Sung's birthday, which is coming up on April 15th. No parade this year for that date, but they may choose to do something. I mean, watching North Korean propaganda, there has been a big focus on self-reliance in a range of industries lately. Specifically, there's been a lot of focus on heavy vehicles, textiles. I think they're looking to show that the sanctions are not having an effect. I think that's also partly the effect of staging a military parade like this. You need to fuel up a bunch of heavy vehicles, march them through your capital city. Regarding testing, I think we are entering the period of solid fuel missiles, at least going to the next level. The North Koreans, as I mentioned on the last podcast, showed one new solid fuel short range missile, and I think that's possibly the one that they might have tested an engine for in October. But they're getting better at building missiles all around. We've seen signs last year that North Korea is looking at composite materials for more efficient airframes for missiles, and we might see some of that come up later this year. We haven't seen a submarine launch ballistic missile tested in a very long time now, and I think they're frankly overdue to test one of those, especially given the hints we've seen about a successor submarine launch ballistic missile to the original Pukguksong-1 KN-11 missile. So we might see some of that coming up. The Pyongyang project, I think, is going to remain important for North Korean propaganda. Kim Jong-un emphasized economics quite a bit in his New Year's Day address, which I think didn't get as much attention because of the inter-Korean stuff, but it continues to be an important part of his own domestic legitimacy. The ability to show that even if the peninsula remains divided, that North Korea can offer something to its people on par with what South Korea offers its people. I think that's where a lot of the Kim regime's legitimacy lies. Obviously, that's not true on the face, but I think including that in propaganda is going to be important for Kim Jong-un.
Great.
Yeah, so Prashant, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, always good to be with you.
Yeah, good conversation, and I'm sure we'll come back to these issues. The Korean Peninsula is not cooling down anytime soon. So to our listeners, thank you for listening. If you haven't yet subscribed to the show, please do so. And if you have, but you haven't yet left us a review, also leave us a review on iTunes. That really helps get the word out about the show. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.